It never ceases to please me and to inspire and uplift me the way that when we join our hearts, there's a harmony that happens before we even get here. And so I just thank Betsy for the word understanding that resonated in her sharing. We know in the month of July, the power among the 12 powers that we know we activate to stay in balance. The 12 powers which correspond to the Eastern chakras. In July, we dedicate our focus to the spiritual power of understanding. The inspirational reading for this morning, in keeping with where my thoughts have particularly been and also my emotions during the silence this week, I have this reading from the Persian poet Khalil Gibran, and it is titled The Gift of Love. And what is it to work with love? It is to weave the cloth with threads drawn from your own heart, even as if your beloved were to wear that cloth. It is to build a house with affection, even as if your beloved were to dwell in that house. This is the part I love. And if you cannot work with love, but only with distaste, it is better that you should leave your work and sit at the gate of the temple and take alms of those who work with joy. Amen. And so I feel the energy in the room this morning radiating from all those who arrived early, working with love and with joy. And I am so grateful to be here with you. And I'm so thankful for our friends on Zoom. And I'm also grateful for the message coming through, which I always remind myself and you that, yes, I suppose at some point I accepted being a teacher and a minister, but trust me, when I'm up here on the podium, I'm actually the biggest student. I just get to do all my learning, as messy and as involved and as confusing as it can be with all of you supporting me. I was inspired to look again at a book that was first published in 1997. And if you were here at Unity of Rochester then, perhaps you were drawn into a circle to study the 4 agreements. It's hard to believe that that's 25 years ago. Wow. And certainly it's been translated in 47 languages. To date, there's something like 12 million copies sold just in the U.S. I'm really fascinated by the whole greater picture of this Toltec culture. And what the author of that book says about those wisdom teachings is sometimes different from what can be found in actually researching it. Nevertheless, I bring this to you this morning, this Toltec wisdom, as evidence that truth is truth wherever it emerges. That truth is unchanging. That the truth, whether it is being taught by an Eastern tradition that's 5,000 or 6,000 years old, or by those of us in the West who follow the master teacher from 2,000 years ago when he manifested in our midst, the truth is one. The truth is changeless and the same. In his latest work, I had no idea that Don Miguel Ruiz is actually by training a surgeon. His mother is in what they call in Spanish an encuratada, which is a healer from the Toltec lineage, and his grandfather, on his mom's side, was what they called a shaman or a master. So they expected that Don Miguel Ruiz, being the youngest of 13 children, would follow in their healing tradition and give his life to that. And he said skepticism was alive in me very early on. And he said, rather than align with a family of healers with a healing tradition, I aligned with the science and went to medical school. It's fascinating to me the number of wisdom teachers that we have, even in the West, who started in science. My favorite two that come to mind are certainly David Hawkins, who you know was a medical doctor, a researcher, a neurologist, a psychiatrist, before he became a teacher of truth, particularly in the last 12 years of his life. Then we have, in my experience anyway, more recently, Dr. Joe Dispenza. And here we have Dr. Don Miguel Ruiz, who knew, this is what I love about our unity tradition, is that we are always called to greater understanding of the principles that we say we live by. I had no idea that in 1979 it was a major car crash that motivated him. Some of us need to be awakened more dramatically. I know that's certainly been my experience. And so after that car crash, he first started devoting himself to teaching spiritual wisdom. What I did not know until this week is that in the year 2002, he suffered a major heart event and was in a coma for 9 days. I have not ordered the book. I'm going to check at the library, but apparently from that experience, hard to believe, already 20 years ago, he has written a new book that deals with life and dying. And I think that as truth students, we're always aware that there is no death except, as the Hindus say, in the dropping of the body. And certainly all of the Eastern traditions encourage us to prepare. Some of you have heard me say in classes that the Eastern tradition says that one thing we really have backward in the West, in our culture, is that when a baby is born, we're all very joyful and excited and happy. And when a person leaves and dies, that we're full of grief and mourning. And they say, in truth, just the opposite is really what needs to happen. That when a new baby comes in, we are to bow to it and say, oh, so you came for the assignment, as we know. And that when death occurs, that the person is moving back toward source into the light, and that is only time for celebration. So born into this family of healers, the Toltec wisdom goes back into the area of Central America to the year 950. And so clearly that culture, their artwork, all of it has gone through various incarnations. When I'm interested in what he's teaching, and specifically I'm interested in the fact that he tells us that beyond good and evil, the real duality that we get trapped in is in truth and lies. And that we have believed a lot of lies through our early programming, through our coping skills as adults. And he says really our assignment as we grow in spiritual understanding is to separate the lies that we still tell ourselves from what is always true. And of course, this speaks to self-love and recognizing that any statements that we put with our I am that is downward trodden or negative is a lie. Because the I am of us is that part of us which is eternal and changeless. It is also the part of us that we can think of as the impersonal life. The I am is the impersonal life living every one of us, and it is that same life that unites us to each other in the oneness. So just to finish with Miguel Ruiz's biography here, he says, you know, the Toltecs have been referred to as a race or a nation, but he says they really are a long tradition of men and women of wisdom and knowledge. They taught in the oral tradition of their ancestors spiritual truths. They were forced at different times in history to hide their teachings. You know, one of those times referenced is during the European conquest. And of course, he says, simply put, the word Toltec means artist. Pardon me. And then he says, in the Toltec way of thinking, every human being is an artist. Instead of calling themselves humans, they call themselves artists. And their art is the art of living from truth. And so isn't that a great assignment for all of us? I have found it very helpful this week to notice those times in consciousness when I might allow a non-truth to pop up. And of course, we know that it is in awareness that we live a life that is more aligned with the one life, the impersonal life, the true life that lives all of us. I think it was helpful for me, and so before I look at those three dreams, I had a really hard time the first time I came across that turn of phrase, the dreams of attention. And so the talk title today is that he has three dreams of attention. And the closest I've come to really understanding that usage is that a dream is an illusion when we're talking in truth. It's whatever is not real. And so it's just a fancy way, in my understanding, of saying which lie, which non-truth or dream are we trapped in by our attention. And so we get hooked into these non-truths, whether they are lies that we are telling ourselves, about others, all of our brothers and sisters, or about the experience of life. And so those are really the three areas, even in unity, that our five principles are applied to. Our health, our sense of abundance, and our relationships. And so I thought it would be helpful to go over those four from 1997. The first one is be impeccable with your word. That can be a full-time job. The second one is not to take anything personally. And of course, you know, when we are immersing ourselves in these teachings, we have to be ready for the testing ground, for the challenge. And so do not take anything personally. It really came up in my life this week. Some of you know that my Unity mother is how I thought of Kathy, passed away on the first day of summer, June 21st. And I saw divinity in that because she always talked about everything is in the Trinity. She loved the Trinity. She loved the number 3. And guess what? June 21st is a 3. And in recognizing that it's not my place to hold a celebration of her life at Unity of Windsor, where I served for 5 years. However, I was fielding a lot of phone calls from people who knew that Kathy had been in my life for 30 years. And her sons, who are both triumphing over very severe health challenges and who live an hour and a half east of Toronto, had decided that they were not going to celebrate her life. So long story short, Kathy and I had a necessary for both of us kind of a distancing that we agreed on last November. And so the lady that took her to her heart surgery that day had been part of the Windsor Unity community for a long time. And I had been out of touch with her anyway for 20 years, but I tracked down her phone number because I knew that she had been with Kathy the night before Kathy died. And I knew that she, along with two other people who told me, had kind of stepped in since November to fill that gap as her next of kin, which I was very honored to do for a long time. So when I called Elaine to tell her about this circle of prayer, that I would like her neighbors of 55 years to have the opportunity for some closure. But above all, I want to have the opportunity to celebrate and to honor the great big personality that Kathy was. Elaine said to me, well, I must tell you that out of respect for Kathy, I'm not going to attend your prayer circle because she cried every day about how hurt she was by you. And that's the kind of test, ladies and gentlemen. Do you see the temptation to take that personally? No, we don't take things personally. Either we learned these 4 agreements 25 years ago and we are applying them as good truth students, or it's just empty lip service. So when I hung up with her, I called a friend to pray. And I said, let us just know the truth that I had already asked Kathy for a sign. And I just said, you know what, Kath, I know we're good. I know we're born a day apart and we both have our stubborn stuff, but I love you and I see you in the light. And the next morning, and if you'd like to see it, you're welcome to ask me after service. The next morning, I got my sign. And trust me, folks, you might have some lies in your programming. I know I did for a long time about, well, we're not supposed to ask God for signs. Really? So the next morning, I'm sitting at my desk, and I look over at my front door where Kathy had the worst time leaving. She was one of these people with very long goodbyes. And I always loved that about her. It took her, from the time she decided to go, I would say generally it took her half an hour to 45 minutes to actually leave. And I always just thought, I love this. She wants to stay here. She wants to be here. That's good. Guess what? On that front door, where she so often leaned to leave my house, the sun streaming from upstairs created an image of a sunlit heart. Up against that door. First I said, thank you, God. Then I said, hi, Kath. Okay, we're good. So why would we take anything personally? In truth, our vision is always to look beyond the personality, the circumstances, the events, the conditions. And so that's the second one. Not to take anything personally. I could go on actually about the first one, which most of you know me well enough by now. That's my favorite one. Be impeccable with your word, because most of my healing through Unity Principles has come around my throat chakra, and words have one frequency when they are held as thought. They take on another vibration when they are emitted through the voice box. That's another intensity of power. And perhaps you've heard that the Chinese never throw anything out that they put in print. They must have a real time with clutter. But the point being that the third level of intensity of words is when they are concrete and written. So the third one is not to make any assumptions. That's very seductive, that third one, particularly when it comes to making judgments. No judgment can ever occur without an assumption that comes before it. And certainly in the Toltec wisdom, they would call that assumption a lie. and really it's not truth. And the fourth one you might recognize is always do your best. The material that inspired me to receive this message today comes from a book that was given to me last year sometime that I also did not know existed, called The Fifth Agreement. And I had no idea, and I had some judgments about it when I got it, so I put it away because I could feel myself thinking, oh yeah, of course, now there's the Fifth Agreement. And in truth, Don Miguel Ruiz tells the story of not being able to teach the Fifth Agreement with any success for about 7 years. He tried. And then his son, following in the healing tradition, said that he would like to try. And Ruiz said, I'm thinking that my son succeeded where I did not in teaching this Fifth Agreement because he had complete faith in it and it's working. And I find it interesting that the Fifth Agreement is to be skeptical, but listen. Be skeptical, but listen. And I find it interesting because in a way it almost sounds as if his life, his journey, up until the Fifth Agreement had come full circle, where he started out skeptical and went into scientific thought, came back to the spiritual, and now, as so many of us do, when we give ourselves permission to just live in the truth and be truthful, he allows that skepticism and doubt have their own kind of power. And it's certainly been my experience to share with you that skepticism and doubt are what result in understanding. And so let's just be okay during the month of July with the power of feeling doubt and skeptical, because eventually it will lead us to truth and it will lead us to deeper understanding. The core part of my message this morning has to do with those dreams of attention. And he talks about them really as 3 phases in our spiritual unfoldment. He says the first dream has to do with victim, feeling, believing, thinking of ourselves as victim during life. When we grow out of that one, we move into the second phase. And by the way, the victim phase, he says, is fraught. It's absolutely fully charged with non-truths. It's living in lies when we are in victimhood. If we move along the path of spiritual evolution, the second phase is what he calls the warrior. And he says in the warrior phase, sometimes you're lying, sometimes you're telling the truth, and you'll recognize that ambivalence if that's where most of the time you feel you still are, caught between those negative self-recriminating tapes, which lead to loathing of self as opposed to the love that we heard in the Gibran poem. And certainly that love must begin with acceptance fully of self. So in that warrior phrase, and I'm just going to read a little bit from that, where he talks about being in that warrior phase. In the second phase, the warrior phase, the language that is spoken is the language of truth. And depending on our awareness in this phase, sometimes we are speaking truth and sometimes we still speak lies. And sometimes we believe those lies and that takes us directly to hell. Sometimes we can rest in believing what is true and it takes us directly to heaven. The symbols that we hold still contain the power of what we believe. And so when we're in the warrior phase, we jump from one dream to another dream. You can imagine that in this phase, the warrior phase, the language of the warrior is 1,000 times better than the language of the victim phase. And I didn't even mention it because I'm so impeccable with my word. I hate to even say it, but he describes the language when we are stuck in victimhood. He says the only language that goes on there is gossip. He says, we gossip about ourselves. Our message is distorted. We gossip and tell lies about the world around us. But mainly, he says, whether we realize it or not, we're always actually gossiping about ourselves. The third phase, which is the stage of mastery, has its own language. So the third dream that captures our attention is this third phase. And in this phase, we speak the language of truth. And how does he describe that? He says, well, we know in this stage without a doubt that all the symbols that we're using are stuff we've made up. They're our creation. And we know that. Perhaps even when we stop to think, language is the biggest symbol and story we tell ourselves. Imagine if I had attached to what this lovely lady who said she would not be attending Kathy's celebration, if I had attached to that story, I would have gone directly to hell. But I chose heaven. I chose truth. I chose to live from the truth of my heart. And so what I love about this stage, and I was saying this to somebody before church, finally in this stage of mastery, we want no more lies. We don't tell ourselves lies because we have mastered awareness and because we see ourselves as life, as truth. And he says the language of truth is exclusive because it's the language of the artist who has mastered dreaming. In the world of the master, there's always music and art. There's always beauty. You know that you are in the phase of mastery because you are mostly at peace, enjoying your life. So just take that in for a moment in its fullness. We know that we are finished with the lies. We are finished with the non-truth, with the symbols that seduce us, with the stories that we tell, either to keep ourselves victims or in the second phase to make other people victims. In the phase of mastery, when we have peace, it is because we have stopped believing in symbols, in stories, and in lies. There's an irony in the third language of the third dream. And he says that in that language, there's often very little speaking. I guess I'll have to wait till next lifetime to fully embrace that. Maybe not. That was a lie. I can embrace it right now. And so the idea that those people in our lives that we might be gifted by who say less but are actually conveying truth become gifts. And he says we are all programmed to shift the languages that we are speaking based on the amount of truth that we are living from. You'll remember the last time that a message came through me a couple of weeks ago. I invited us to take ownership of being a messenger and of being both the medium and the message. And so this morning I'd like to close with what Don Miguel Ruiz says about being messengers of truth. And he says, as humans, we are always conveying a message. Everything that human beings create in consciousness exists first in our imaginations. All the feelings, all the cultures, all the computers, everything. It was first in our imagination, and then we make it real. And we can use all of the agreements, he says, to restore balance in ourselves so that that balance then radiates outward. You think we might be able to use some balance right now on planet Earth? Yes, yes. And so he says, agreements speak directly to human integrity. What is that? What is integrity? In its derivation, that word comes from the same word as wholeness, as completeness, as oneness, as non-fragmentation. He puts this appeal out. He says, will you help me to change the world? Planet Earth needs humanity to be aware of the world that each one of us is creating every moment in mind. That is the only world that we can change, is the one that we are continually creating. The benefit when I change my world is that I live in peace, in joy, in love, and in harmony with myself, which means that I only see love when I look at a brother, at a sister, at a circumstance, and that I call every experience an opportunity. He says, change humanity by changing my own world. How wonderful a world we envision when first we agree to live in the truth, to speak only truth, and to tell ourselves only stories about ourselves and about others that are true. So on the way into church this morning, someone said to me, I'm mean. And I said, that's a lie. So sometimes you have to know your audience because it takes a consciousness that is highly developed, open and receptive to be able to take that kind of a comment. And still, it is a gift when we can be direct, honest, and clear in how we communicate. Amen.